Sarah Chen nearly choked on her morning coffee when she looked out her kitchen window and saw what her neighbor had done overnight. Where yesterday there had been a modest drainage ditch that had quietly carried rainwater away from both their properties for over a century, there was now nothing but freshly packed dirt and pristine sod, as if the ditch had never existed at all. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered, setting down her mug with shaking hands. The drainage ditch wasn't just some random depression in the yard. It was the reason her 1920s craftsman home had never flooded in its 100-year history, even during the epic storms that had devastated other parts of their Denver suburb. Sarah grabbed her jacket and marched outside, her breath visible in the crisp October morning air. The evidence was undeniable. Someone had trucked in tons of soil and methodically filled the entire length of the ditch that ran along the property line between her house and her new neighbor's colonial-style McMansion. The work was thorough, professional, and completely illegal. "Admiring my landscaping project," came a sickeningly sweet voice from behind her. Sarah spun around to face Margaret Whitmore, the 50-something blonde who had moved in 6 months ago and immediately announced herself as the new president of the Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. Margaret stood in her perfectly manicured yard wearing a baby pink tracksuit that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly mortgage payment, a self-satisfied smile plastered across her Botox face. "You filled in the drainage ditch," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice level. "That ditch has been there since before either of our houses were built. It's what keeps our basements from flooding." Margaret's smile never wavered. That ugly little trench was an absolute eyesore that violated 3 different HOA covenants regarding yard maintenance and aesthetic standards. "I brought this neighborhood's property values up by 15% since I took over as president, and I won't have some Depression-era drainage solution dragging us back down." "Depression era?" Sarah stared at her in disbelief. "Margaret, that ditch was engineered by the original developers in 1923. It's literally marked on the city's drainage maps. Every house in this section depends on it for flood control." "Well, I hired a proper drainage contractor who assures me that modern French drains and foundation waterproofing make these primitive ditches completely unnecessary," Margaret replied, examining her perfectly manicured nails. "This isn't 1950, Sarah. We have better solutions now." Sarah felt her blood pressure rising. She'd been a civil engineer for 15 years before starting her consulting firm, and she knew exactly how water behaved on sloped terrain. Their street sat on a natural grade that funneled rainwater directly toward their properties. The drainage ditch had been carefully positioned to intercept that flow and channel it safely to the storm drain system 3 blocks away. Without it, the water would pool against foundations and flood basements, particularly Margaret's, since her house sat at the bottom of the natural slope. "Margaret, you need to understand something about water flow and—" "I understand plenty about property values and neighborhood standards," Margaret interrupted, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "What I don't understand is why you're so attached to this muddy little ditch when I've clearly improved both our properties. You should be thanking me." "Thanking you?" Sarah's professional composure finally cracked. "You just eliminated the only thing protecting our homes from flooding. The spring snowmelt alone is going tow." "I've done my research," Margaret snapped. "I consulted with 3 different contractors, and they all agreed that the ditch was outdated and unnecessary. Plus, it was attracting mosquitoes and making it impossible to maintain a proper lawn edge." Sarah took a deep breath, trying a different approach. "Margaret, did you check with the city before doing this work? Because I'm pretty sure there's a drainage easement. I don't need the city's permission to improve my own property," Margaret shot back. "And before you start throwing around legal terms, you should know that I've already filed a formal complaint with the HOA about the weeds and debris that were collecting in that ditch on your side of the property line. Frankly, your negligence forced my hand." "My negligence?" Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. "I clean that ditch every spring and fall. It's been working perfectly for 100 years. Margaret's smile returned, but it was colder now. Working perfectly for whom? Because it certainly wasn't working for my property values or my landscaping vision. And since I'm the HOA president, I have both the authority and the responsibility to address covenant violations when I see them." Sarah stared at her neighbor, finally understanding what she was dealing with. This wasn't about drainage or property maintenance. This was about control. Margaret had decided that century-old infrastructure was beneath her aesthetic standards, and she was willing to risk both their homes to prove her point. "The spring storms start in April," Sarah said quietly. "That's less than 6 months away. When the snowpack melts and we get our first real rainfall, the water has to go somewhere. And without that ditch, it's going straight into our basements." Margaret laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a tornado. "Oh, Sarah, you're so dramatic. My contractor installed a state-of-the-art French drain system and waterproofed my foundation. I'm not worried about a little spring rain. What about my foundation?" "Well," Margaret said, her smile turning predatory, "I suppose you should have." 3 days after discovering the filled drainage ditch, Sarah found a certified letter waiting in her mailbox. The return address made her stomach drop: Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, with Margaret Whitmore's name printed in bold letters beneath the official seal. Inside were 3 separate violation notices, each printed on expensive letterhead and written in the kind of legal language designed to intimidate. The first cited her for failure to maintain property drainage systems, claiming that debris and weeds in the former ditch had created an environmental hazard. The second accused her of improper yard waste disposal for the autumn leaves that had naturally collected in the ditch before Margaret filled it. The third and most audacious cited her for failure to obtain HOA approval for landscape modifications, apparently referring to a small rain garden she'd installed 2 years earlier with full HOA approval. Each violation came with a $150 fine and a demand that she appear before the HOA board within 10 days to contest the charges or face additional penalties. "Unbelievable," Sarah muttered, reading through the notices a second time. Margaret wasn't just covering her tracks. She was going on the offensive, trying to paint Sarah as the problem while positioning herself as the responsible neighbor who'd been forced to take action. That evening, Sarah drove to the county courthouse and spent 3 hours in the records department pulling every document related to their properties. What she found was better than she hoped. The drainage easement wasn't just a gentleman's agreement between old neighbors. It was a legally recorded right-of-way that appeared on the original 1923 subdivision plat. More importantly, it had been renewed and referenced in every property deed since then, including Margaret's own purchase documents from 6 months earlier. The easement language was crystal clear. A perpetual drainage easement of 15 feet in width is hereby established along the natural drainage course running north-south between lots 47 and 48, for the purpose of stormwater management and flood control. Margaret's contractor hadn't just filled in a ditch, they'd illegally obstructed a recorded easement that predated the HOA by 53 years. Armed with copies of the historical documents, Sarah requested an emergency meeting with the HOA board. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening in the community center, and Sarah spent the weekend preparing her presentation. She created a timeline showing the easement's legal history, collected photographs of the original ditch, and even found old city engineering reports that reference its importance to the neighborhood's flood control system. Thursday night, Sarah arrived at the community center with a folder full of documentation and a laptop loaded with her presentation. She'd expected a standard conference room setup, with maybe half a dozen board members. Instead, she walked into what looked like a town hall meeting, with 30-plus neighbors packed into folding chairs and Margaret holding court at the front of the room like a prosecutor about to deliver a closing argument. "Thank you all for coming," Margaret announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "As most of you know, we're here to address several serious covenant violations that have been brought to the board's attention. These violations not only impact our property values, but potentially expose our HOA to liability issues." Sarah realized with growing dread that Margaret had stacked the deck. Half the people in the room were nodding along as Margaret described the hazardous conditions that have allegedly existed in the drainage ditch, complete with blown-up photographs that made a few scattered leaves look like an environmental disaster. The previous property owner of 1247 Maple Street, Margaret, never used Sarah's name, always referring to her by address as if she were just a temporary occupant, has consistently failed to maintain the drainage area along our shared property line. Despite repeated requests from neighbors, weeds, debris, and standing water created both aesthetic and health concerns. "That's not true," Sarah interjected, standing up from her seat in the back. "I maintained that ditch religiously, and there was never any standing water because it was working exactly as designed." Margaret's smile was razor-sharp. "I'm sure Ms. Chen believes she was maintaining the area adequately, but the photographic evidence speaks for itself. More concerning is her apparent belief that she can modify neighborhood drainage systems without proper oversight or approval." The room buzzed with murmurs, and Sarah realized that Margaret had somehow convinced these people that she, not Margaret, had been the one making unauthorized changes. The manipulation was masterful and absolutely infuriating. "If I could just present the documentation I'd brought," Sarah began, but Margaret cut her off. "Of course, we'll review any materials you'd like to submit, but first the board needs to address the immediate safety concerns. Bob, would you please read the environmental assessment?" Bob Henderson, whom Sarah recognized as Margaret's next-door neighbor on the other side, stood up with an official-looking document. The contractor's report indicates that the previous drainage configuration created potential breeding grounds for mosquitoes and posed erosion risks to adjacent foundations. The new drainage solution eliminates these hazards while providing superior water management through modern French drain technology. Sarah felt like she was living in an alternate reality. That's completely backwards. The original ditch prevented erosion and flooding. By filling it in, you've eliminated the only protection our houses have. Ms. Chen, Margaret interrupted, her voice taking on a patronizing tone. I understand this change might seem dramatic, but sometimes progress requires us to move beyond outdated solutions. The board has already approved the new drainage system, and 3 independent contractors have verified its superiority to the previous arrangement. The board can approve the elimination of a recorded easement. Sarah finally exploded, pulling out her folder of documents. I have the original plat maps, the deed restrictions, and 50 years of legal documentation proving that drainage easement has protected this entire neighborhood since 1923. The room fell silent. Margaret's confident smile flickered for just a moment before returning full force. Legal documentation can certainly be complex, she said smoothly, and the board appreciates your research efforts. However, we have our own legal counsel who has reviewed all relevant covenants and confirmed that our drainage improvements are both legal and beneficial to the community. Sarah looked around the room, seeing doubt creeping into some faces, but others still nodding along with Margaret's performance. She realized with growing horror that Margaret had spent months cultivating these relationships, painting herself as the competent leader who brought order and increased property values to their neighborhood. I'd like to request a formal legal review of the easement documentation, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. Of course, Margaret replied. The board will be happy to have our attorney examine your materials. In the meantime, however, the existing violation notices remain in effect and will need to see immediate compliance with the landscaping standards outlined in your citation letters. As the meeting broke up, several neighbors approached Sarah with sympathetic looks and quiet words of support, but none were willing to challenge Margaret openly. One elderly man named Frank Morrison lingered after the others had left. I remember when they put that ditch in, he said quietly. My dad helped dig it by hand back in 24, saved every house on this street during the flood of 65. Then you know I'm right about this, Sarah said hopefully. Frank nodded sadly. Oh, I know you're right. But Margaret's got the board wrapped around her finger, and most folks are scared of getting on her bad side. She's already gone after the paddles for their garden gnomes and forced the Johnsons to repaint their shutters twice. He patted Sarah's shoulder. Just watch yourself, dear. That woman doesn't like to lose. Walking back to her car, Sarah felt the first drops of an unexpected November rain beginning to fall. As she drove home, she noticed water starting to pool in low spots along the street, areas that should have been draining into the system that Margaret had destroyed. The real test was still months away, but even this light drizzle was revealing cracks in Margaret's perfect plan. Sarah just hoped she could prove her point before the spring storms arrived and turned those cracks into a catastrophe. The first major storm of spring arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April, 3 weeks earlier than the Weather Service had predicted. Sarah woke to the sound of rain hammering against her bedroom windows with an intensity that made her stomach clench with dread. She'd been watching the weather forecasts obsessively since March, knowing that this moment was inevitable. By 6 a.m., 2 inches had already fallen, and the meteorologists were calling for another 4 to 6 inches before the storm moved through. Sarah made coffee and positioned herself at her kitchen window, watching the water streaming down the sloped street toward their properties. Without the drainage ditch to intercept and redirect the flow, every drop was heading straight for the foundations of both houses. At first, Margaret's French drain system seemed to be holding up. The decorative rocks around her foundation remained visible, and no obvious pooling was apparent in her perfectly manicured yard. Sarah began to wonder if maybe, somehow, Margaret's expensive contractor had actually solved the problem. Then, around 9 a.m., she noticed the first signs of trouble. Water was beginning to collect along the property line where the drainage ditch used to be, creating a growing puddle that had nowhere to go. Margaret's French drain, designed to handle normal roof runoff and minor yard drainage, was completely overwhelmed by the volume of water that the original ditch had been engineered to manage. The pooling water was starting to seep toward Margaret's foundation, following the natural grade of the land. By noon, with rain still falling steadily, Sarah could see dark stains appearing along the base of Margaret's house. The water was finding its way into the basement through foundation cracks and window wells that had never been tested by this kind of sustained moisture pressure. Meanwhile, Sarah's house, positioned on slightly higher ground and protected by proper grading that directed water away from her foundation, remained completely dry. Sarah's phone rang just after 1 p.m. "This is all your fault." Margaret's voice was shrill with panic. "My basement is flooding, and I know you did something to cause this." "Margaret, I haven't done anything," Sarah replied, watching through her window as water continued to rise around her neighbor's foundation. "The drainage ditch would have prevented exactly what's happening to you right now. Don't you dare try to blame this on my drainage improvements. Your property is obviously channeling water onto mine somehow. I'm calling the city and filing a complaint." "The city's going to tell you the same thing I did 6 months ago," Sarah said, trying to keep the satisfaction out of her voice. "Water flows downhill, and you eliminated the system that was designed to manage it." Margaret hummed up without another word. By 3 p.m., the rain had intensified even further, and Sarah could see Margaret in her basement window, frantically running a shop vacuum while her husband hauled waterlogged boxes up the stairs. The water was now several inches deep in their basement, turning Margaret's finished rec room into a disaster zone. Sarah's doorbell rang at 4:30 p.m. She opened it to find Margaret standing on her front porch, soaking wet and looking more disheveled than Sarah had ever seen her. The perfectly styled blonde hair was plastered to her head, her makeup had run down her cheeks, and her designer outfit was stained with basement floodwater. "You'd have to help me," Margaret said, her voice cracking with desperation. "My insurance company says flooding from surface water isn't covered unless it's from a city system failure. They're calling this a drainage issue and won't pay for any of the damage." Sarah stared at her neighbor, remembering all the violation notices, the hostile board meeting, and months of condescending lectures about modern drainage solutions. "Help you how?" Sarah asked. "You must have some kind of sump pump or drainage system that's working," Margaret continued, her usual arrogance replaced by pleading urgency. "Maybe we could connect my basement to whatever you're using, or you could let me run a hose from your yard to drain some of this water." "Margaret, my basement isn't flooding because my house was built to work with the original drainage system, not against it," Sarah explained. "The only thing that would help you is restoring the drainage ditch you filled in." Margaret's face twisted with a combination of desperation and rage. "I can't restore the ditch. Do you have any idea how much money I spent on that landscaping project? The contractor said the French drain system was better than any old-fashioned ditch." "Better at what?" "Because it's clearly not better at preventing basement flooding." "This is a freak storm," Margaret snapped, some of her old hostility returning. "No one could have predicted this much rain." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Margaret the weather app. "The National Weather Service has been predicting heavy spring rains for months. This is exactly what I warned you about." As if summoned by their conversation, Margaret's husband, Dave, appeared at Sarah's door, looking exhausted and defeated. "Margaret, we need to get back down there. The water's getting into the electrical panel." "Dave, maybe Sarah has some equipment we could borrow." "No," Dave interrupted, his voice flat with resignation. "Sarah tried to warn us about this months ago, and he threatened to sue her. She doesn't owe us anything." Margaret whirled on her husband. "You can't seriously be taking her side." "I'm not taking anyone's side," Dave replied wearily. "I'm just stating facts. Sarah told us this would happen, you said she was wrong, and now our basement is flooded. Maybe it's time to admit that your drainage contractor didn't know what he was talking about." "The contractor was certified and licensed," Margaret protested. "He had references and insurance and he obviously didn't understand how water drainage works in this neighborhood." Dave cut her off. "Sarah's an engineer, Margaret. Maybe we should have listened to her instead of trying to force her to pay HOA fines." Sarah watched this exchange with a mixture of vindication and genuine sympathy. Despite everything Margaret had put her through, seeing her neighbor's basement flooding wasn't actually satisfying. It was just sad and wasteful. "Look," Sarah said finally, "I can't fix your immediate problem, but I can give you the name of a good water damage restoration company. And for what it's worth, I really am sorry this happened." Margaret stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah could see the exact moment when the reality of the situation finally sank in. The perfect control Margaret had exercised over the HOA, her confidence in modern solutions over proven systems, her certainty that she knew better than everyone else. All of it was 2 weeks after the first flood, with Margaret's basement still drying out from thousands of dollars in water damage. Sarah received another certified letter. This time it wasn't just from the HOA, it was from Patterson Mills and Associates, a law firm downtown that specialized in property disputes. The letter was breathtaking in its audacity. Margaret was suing Sarah for $47,000 in damages, claiming that Sarah had negligently altered natural water flow patterns and failed to maintain adequate drainage systems, resulting in foreseeable property damage to adjacent homeowners. The lawsuit also demanded that Sarah pay for the installation of additional drainage infrastructure to prevent future flooding. Sarah read the legal document 3 times, each reading making her angrier than the last. Margaret wasn't just refusing to take responsibility for her own actions. She was actively trying to make Sarah pay for the consequences of Margaret's illegal destruction of the drainage easement. The same day the lawsuit arrived, Sarah received a notice for another emergency HOA board meeting. This time, the agenda was clear. Motion to assess special fees against 1247 Maple Street for drainage infrastructure improvements and flood damage liability. Sarah had had enough. She called Rebecca Martinez, an attorney who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. Rebecca listened to Sarah's story with growing amazement, occasionally asking for clarification on the more outrageous details. "Let me get this straight," Rebecca said when Sarah finished. "She illegally filled in a recorded drainage easement, ignored your warnings about flooding, watched her basement flood exactly as you predicted, and now she's suing you for damages. and the HOA is trying to make you pay for her mistakes. That's about the size of it, Sarah confirmed. Do you have all the documentation we discussed? The original plat maps, the recorded easement, the deed references. Everything. Plus photographs of the original ditch, the filled-in area, and the flooding. I also have copies of all her violation notices and the records from the HOA meetings. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Sarah, this is either going to be the easiest case I've ever handled, or I'm missing something fundamental about property law. When can you come in to sign a retainer agreement? The next morning, Rebecca fired back with a response that was a work of legal art. Not only did she file a motion to dismiss Margaret's lawsuit as frivolous, but she also filed a countersuit against both Margaret and the HOA for harassment, property damage, and violation of Sarah's easement rights. The countersuit demanded restoration of the drainage ditch, removal of Margaret from the HOA board, and payment of Sarah's legal fees. But Rebecca's most devastating move was her third filing, a formal complaint with the city's code enforcement department. It turned out that Margaret's contractor had never obtained the required permits for filling in the drainage ditch. In Colorado, any work that altered established drainage patterns required both city permits and environmental impact assessments. Margaret's professional contractor had ignored these requirements entirely, assuming that work on private property was automatically exempt from city oversight. It wasn't. The city's response was swift and merciless. Within a week, Margaret received a stop work order for any future drainage modifications, a $5,000 fine for unpermitted work affecting municipal drainage systems, and a legal demand to restore the original drainage configuration within 30 days or face additional penalties of $500 per day. Margaret's world was collapsing, but she wasn't going down without a fight. The emergency HOA meeting was held on a Thursday evening in early May, just as the second major storm system of the season was moving into the Denver area. Sarah arrived with Rebecca and a briefcase full of legal documentation, prepared for battle. This time, the meeting had a very different energy. Word of the lawsuit and countersuit had spread through the neighborhood, and many residents were beginning to question Margaret's version of events. Frank Morrison, the elderly neighbor who remembered the original ditch construction, had spent the past 2 weeks talking to other longtime residents about the flooding patterns they'd observed over the decades. Margaret called the meeting to order, but her usual commanding presence was noticeably strained. The past month of dealing with flood damage, insurance disputes, legal bills, and city violations had taken its toll. Her perfectly styled appearance was still intact, but the confidence that had made her such an effective HOA dictator was cracking. We're here tonight to address the ongoing drainage crisis that has affected several properties in our neighborhood. Margaret began, carefully avoiding any admission of personal responsibility. The board has received expert recommendations for a comprehensive drainage solution that will protect all homeowners from future flood damage. Rebecca stood up. Before we discuss any proposed solutions, I think the board should be made aware of some important legal developments. Margaret's face went pale. I'm not sure this is the appropriate forum for. Oh, I think it's very appropriate, Rebecca continued smoothly, especially since the proposed assessment directly affects my client's property rights. She pulled out a thick folder. The HOA is attempting to charge Ms. Chen for drainage improvements to fix flooding caused by the illegal destruction of a recorded easement. An easement, I should note, that predates this HOA by more than 50 years. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several board members were looking uncomfortable, clearly hearing some of these details for the first time. Rebecca continued. Furthermore, the city has now confirmed that the work done to eliminate the drainage ditch violated multiple municipal codes and was performed without required permits. Ms. Whitmore is facing significant fines and has been ordered to restore the original drainage system at her own expense. That's not, the contractor assured us. Margaret stammered, but Rebecca cut her off. The contractor's assurances are irrelevant. The legal responsibility lies with the property owner who authorized unpermitted work that damaged municipal infrastructure. Which brings me to the HOA's liability in this matter. The room fell silent. Rebecca had everyone's complete attention now. The HOA board voted to approve drainage modifications without verifying that the work was legal or properly permitted. By endorsing the destruction of a recorded easement, the board may have exposed the entire HOA to liability for resulting property damage. I strongly recommend that the board consult with independent legal counsel before proceeding with any drainage-related assessments. Board member Bob Henderson, who had been Margaret's most vocal supporter, raised his hand nervously. Are you saying the HOA could be sued over this? I'm saying the HOA has already been sued, Rebecca replied, pulling out another document. My client has filed a countersuit against both Ms. Whitmore and the HOA for violation of her easement rights and harassment. We're seeking damages, legal fees, and removal of board members who participated in illegal retaliation against my client. The meeting erupted in concerned conversations. Several neighbors were demanding to know why they hadn't been informed about the legal risks, while others were questioning how the board had approved such expensive drainage work without proper due diligence. Margaret tried to regain control. "This is all just legal maneuvering. The fact remains that we have a drainage problem that needs to be solved, and—" "Actually," interrupted Dave, Margaret's own husband, standing up from the back of the room, "we have a drainage problem that was created when Margaret filled in a ditch that had worked perfectly for 100 years. And now she's trying to make the entire neighborhood pay to fix her mistake." The betrayal was devastating. Margaret stared at her husband in shock, clearly not expecting him to publicly contradict her version of events. Margaret Whitmore held out for exactly 18 days. 18 days of daily $500 fines from the city. 18 days of her basement flooding every time the sprinkler system ran too long. 18 days of legal bills mounting as her attorney tried unsuccessfully to challenge the drainage easement that had been legally recorded since before Margaret was born. And 18 days of watching Sarah's house remain completely dry while Margaret's foundation took on water like a sinking ship. The breaking point came during the third major storm of the season, a Memorial Day weekend deluge that dropped 6 inches of rain in 12 hours. Margaret's French drain system, already overwhelmed by previous storms, failed completely. Water poured into her basement faster than 3 industrial pumps could remove it, ruining her husband's workshop, her exercise equipment, and the new water heater they'd just installed to replace the one damaged in the first flood. That Tuesday morning, Sarah watched from her kitchen window as a small convoy of trucks arrived at Margaret's house, the excavation crew that would restore the drainage ditch Margaret had destroyed 8 months earlier. The work took 3 days. Sarah had to admit there was something deeply satisfying about watching the careful excavation reveal the original path of the century-old waterway. The workers followed the exact specifications from the 1923 engineering plans, creating a modern version of the drainage system that had protected the neighborhood for generations before Margaret's aesthetic sensibilities had gotten in the way. Margaret supervised the work from her front porch, her face a mask of barely controlled rage. She hadn't spoken to Sarah since the HOA meeting, but her glares could have melted steel. Dave, on the other hand, had stopped by Sarah's house the day before to apologize personally for everything his wife had put her through. "I should have stood up to her months ago," he'd said, looking exhausted and older than his 55 years. But Margaret doesn't like being contradicted, and honestly, it was easier to just go along with her ideas than fight about them. "I didn't realize how far she'd taken things until I saw those legal papers." On Thursday afternoon, the excavation crew finished installing the final drainage connections and began cleaning up their equipment. Sarah was in her backyard when she heard Margaret's voice calling her name, the first time they'd spoken directly since the morning Margaret had shown up begging for help during the first flood. "Are you satisfied now?" Margaret demanded, standing at the property line where the restored drainage ditch cut a neat channel between their yards. "You've humiliated me in front of the entire neighborhood, cost me tens of thousands of dollars, and forced me to destroy my landscaping project." Sarah set down her gardening tools and walked over to the fence. Margaret looked like she aged 5 years in the past month. The stress of the legal battles, the constant flooding, and the mounting bills had taken their toll on her previously immaculate appearance. "Margaret, I tried to warn you about this 8 months ago," Sarah said gently. "I never wanted any of this to happen. I just wanted you to understand that the drainage ditch was there for a reason. Don't you dare pretend this was about protecting the neighborhood." Margaret snapped. "This was about you wanting to control me, to make me look stupid in front of everyone." Sarah stared at her neighbor, finally understanding that Margaret would never accept responsibility for what had happened. In Margaret's mind, she was the victim of some elaborate conspiracy rather than the architect of her own expensive disaster. "Believe whatever you want," Sarah replied. "But that ditch is going to keep both our basements dry for the next 100 years, just like it did for the 100 years before you filled it in." Margaret's face flushed with anger. "This isn't over, Sarah. I'm going to appeal the city's decision, and I'm going to fight your ridiculous lawsuit, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows what kind of vindictive person you really are." Actually, came a voice from behind them. "It is over." Both women turned to see Rebecca Martins walking up Sarah's driveway with a folder in her hand and a smile on her face. "I have some good news," Rebecca announced. "The court has ruled on our motion for summary judgment. Ms. Chen, you've won on all counts." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Everything? Everything. The judge found that the drainage easement is legally valid and was illegally obstructed. He's ordered full restoration of the drainage system, which you've already completed, and awarded you $12,000 in legal fees and damages. He also issued a permanent injunction preventing any future interference with the drainage easement." Margaret went white. "That's impossible." "My attorney said." "Your attorney was wrong," Rebecca replied crisply. "Property law is pretty clear on this issue. You can't destroy a recorded easement just because you don't like how it looks." She handed Sarah a copy of the court order. The HOA portion of the lawsuit has also been settled. The new board has agreed to remove all the bogus violation notices from your file and issue a formal apology. They're also updating the HOA covenants to specifically reference the drainage easement to prevent future misunderstandings. "What about Margaret's lawsuit against me?" Sarah asked. Rebecca's smile widened. "Dismissed with prejudice." The judge was less than impressed with the idea that someone could sue their neighbor for damages caused by their own illegal actions. "Ms. Whitmore will also be responsible for your legal fees from defending against her frivolous lawsuit." Margaret looked like she might faint. "How much?" "Another $8,000, Rebecca replied cheerfully, "plus the city fines, which I believe are up to about $9,000 by now. And of course, the cost of restoring the drainage ditch, the flood damage repairs, the increased insurance premiums." She pretended to calculate. "I estimate this whole adventure has cost you somewhere north of $60,000. The number hit Margaret like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her face cycling through disbelief, rage, and despair. "This is insane," she whispered. "All of this over a stupid ditch that barely anyone even noticed." "Actually," Sarah said quietly, "all of this could have been avoided if you just listened when I tried to explain why that stupid ditch was important." Margaret stood there for a long moment, swaying slightly as the full magnitude of her defeat sank in. Finally, without another word, she turned and walked back toward her house, her shoulders hunched in defeat. 6 weeks later, Sarah was working in her garden when she noticed the for sale sign going up in Margaret's front yard. Dave had filed for divorce 2 weeks earlier, citing irreconcilable differences and financial irresponsibility, and Margaret was apparently liquidating everything to pay her legal bills and court judgments. The house sold quickly. The restored drainage ditch was actually a selling point for buyers who understood the importance of proper flood control. The new owners, a young couple with engineering backgrounds, stopped by to introduce themselves and thank Sarah for fighting to preserve the neighborhood's historic drainage infrastructure. "We almost didn't buy in this area because of flooding concerns," the wife explained. "But when our realtor showed us the drainage easement and told us the story of how you fought to protect it, we knew this was exactly the kind of neighborhood we wanted to live in, one where people care about doing things right instead of just doing things that look pretty." That evening, Sarah sat on her back deck with a glass of wine, watching a gentle spring rain fill the restored drainage ditch and carry water safely away from both houses. Her phone buzzed with a text from Frank Morrison, the elderly neighbor who'd remembered the original ditch construction. "Saw the moving trucks at Margaret's place today. Dave's staying in the neighborhood. Bought a condo over on Oak Street. Says he's never been happier to live somewhere with sensible drainage. Thanks for fighting the good fight, Sarah. My dad would have been proud." Sarah smiled and raised her wine glass in a toast to the modest waterway that had started such an epic battle. The century-old engineering was working exactly as designed, protecting homes and preventing floods with a quiet efficiency that had made it invisible to people like Margaret, until it was gone. Sometimes the old ways really were the best ways, and sometimes standing up to bullies was worth every penny of legal fees, every sleepless night of worry, and every moment of satisfaction when justice finally prevailed. In her basement, Sarah's foundation remained perfectly dry. Outside, the drainage ditch carried away another Colorado storm, just as it had for 100 years before and would for 100 years to come. Margaret Whitmore was gone, but the ditch remained, a testament to the power of good engineering over bad aesthetics, and proof that some battles are worth fighting, no matter how small they might seem to everyone else.